The president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, is in China as we speak. And this is not getting a lot of attention. There was more attention paid when the French president, Macron, went to China recently and made some remarkable statements about the fact that Europe should not fully align itself with the United States. By the way, the New York Times sort of retaliated against Macron by saying he's now very isolated among the Europeans. I suspect this is not true. In fact, it's more likely that Macron is reflecting. Remember, Europe has always had a certain resentment toward the United States, always wanted to maintain a distinctive identity, always wanted to have Europe hang together, but hang separately from the United States. And so Macron, I think, is reflecting what other European leaders are thinking, although maybe not saying so bluntly. But here's Lula da Silva in China, and this is part of a Chinese bid to establish real beachheads in Latin and South America. That's the geopolitical significance of it. So what is the number one thing that the Chinese Premier Xi wants to achieve with Lula da Silva? It's very obvious. It is basically for Brazil and China to increase their mutual trade, but to do it in the Chinese currency, in Chinese yen, not in US dollars. So the Chinese have been very successful in starting to create an alternative currency. We have the BRICS arrangement with Brazil and India and South Africa and China. And so China wants to sort of get that going and get a flourishing trade between many countries in the world, trading with each other and with China. The Chinese want to trade in yen with themselves, of course. That's their currency. But they also want other countries to trade away from the dollar. So they don't mind if the Indians and the Malaysians start swapping currencies or trade in something other than the dollar. They prefer it to be the yen, but most importantly, they don't want it to be the dollar. Another objective on the part of Xi is to get Lula and to get Brazil into the China Belt and Road Initiative. What's the Belt and Road Initiative? Just to remind you, it is the Chinese massive global infrastructure project in which the Chinese basically say things like, we'll come into Brazil, we'll set up manufacturing plants, we'll create tens of thousands of jobs, we'll build roads and highways. In fact, they often sweeten the bribe, if you will, to the politicians in these countries. We'll build you a new presidential palace, we'll build you a new amphitheater where you can now have spectacular meetings for the parliament and for the legislature. So the Chinese are up to what the Chinese are good at, and that is transactional deal making. And they don't hesitate to say, listen, we're not going to be talking to you about human rights. We're not going to be talking to you about democracy. In fact, don't talk to us about democracy or human rights either. So this is a purely economic, pragmatic, and as I said, transactional deal. Now, this is part of other bigger things that are happening around the world. For example, you've probably heard of the ASEAN countries, ASEAN, which is the Asian countries. These are countries like Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. So these ASEAN countries are now getting together at the ASEAN meetings and figuring out, how do we drop the US dollar and the euro and the Chinese yen? In fact, there's been a desire on the part of many of these countries to have a certain amount of autonomy and not be currency pawns of the US or Europe or China for that matter. And so their idea is, why don't we develop some sort of a currency in which we just trade with each other? So I think this is where the world is going. It's not that the dollar is going to be replaced by the Chinese yen. It's just going to be that the dollar loses its kind of dominant, everybody trades in the dollar, all trade is converted into dollars and then back into the original currencies. We're going to see this kind of mishmash of arrangements. But what it means is it does signal this multilateral or multipolar world that we seem to be moving toward. In fact, the Prime Minister of Indonesia has even said, listen, we in the ASEAN countries, We don't even need Visa and MasterCard. Let's start chopping those off at the block. In other words, let's start getting rid not just of the currency, but of the credit card system that has been universalized. Think about it. You can go pretty much anywhere in the world. Here's my American Express. Here's my Visa. Here's my MasterCard. I remember many years ago, I was talking to a guy from another country, and he's like, how do you get an American Express Gold card? He was really shocked. But of course, one way to get an American Express Gold card is to be in America and to be an American. It's much easier to do than to get an American Express Gold card in, let's say, Sri Lanka or in some parts of South America for that matter. So I'm really amazed when I think about all this to see the rapidity of the decline of U.S. influence. In fact, when the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 80s and early 90s, this was seen, I thought this was almost a singular event in world history. Never so quickly had a massive global empire kind of unraveled and gone poof. And I'm not saying the United States is headed for the same fate, but there are similar indications that our system is kind of cracking up in the same way that the Soviet Union did. And if so, that's very bad news for us, and in some ways, very bad news for the world.